A police officer detains a man identical to his deceased son. Hours later, he goes to the grave to visit him and is left speechless when he sees that. Marcos was driving slowly down a narrow, dark street, barely illuminated by worn-out streetlights that flickered intermittently. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his eyes moved attentively from side to side, searching for any suspicious movement. Since he had lost his son, his patrol nights had become a mechanical act, a routine he used to silence the pain and fill the void Samuel had left in his life. Suddenly, in the distance, he saw a car parked at the edge of the sidewalk. It was unusual to see a car parked in that part of the neighborhood, especially at that hour of the night. Marcos frowned, took his radio, and in a low voice, notified his position. He turned off his lights and approached in silence, letting his instincts as a police officer guide him. When he looked through the car window, he saw a young man who, to Marcos's surprise, appeared to be asleep or in a deep trance. The young man's face was partially covered by his messy hair, but something in his features immediately caught Marcos's attention. That face. It was an image he had buried deep in his memory, almost like an echo of a life he had left behind. With a firm and professional voice, Marcos tapped on the car window. "Young man, please roll down the window." The boy jumped, waking up with a start and looking at Marcos with a mix of confusion and disorientation. Marcos tried to keep his composure as the young man rubbed his eyes, trying to focus his vision. "Are you all right?" Marcos asked, feeling his voice tremble slightly, betraying his own nervousness. "What are you doing here at this hour? Do you have any identification with you?" The young man nodded, still bewildered, and searched his pocket to take out his wallet. When he extended his ID toward Marcos, he took the card and read the name aloud, Alejandro Fuentes. He felt his breath catch in his throat. The resemblance was overwhelming, beyond any coincidence. "Is something wrong?" the young man asked softly, looking at him with some caution. Marcos, without taking his eyes off him, swallowed. "No, it's just, do you live around here?" Alejandro shook his head. "No, I was passing through. I felt tired and thought about stopping for a moment. Sorry if I caused any inconvenience." The words sounded sincere, but Marcos couldn't shake the feeling of seeing a ghost. His mind tried to find logic in what he was witnessing, but Samuel's face kept returning, assaulting his memory with vivid images of the boy he once was. "You have an impressive resemblance to someone I knew a long time ago," he finally murmured, without taking his eyes off him. Alejandro frowned, puzzled. "Someone you knew?" Marcos smiled weakly, unsure if he should say more. "It doesn't matter, sorry. Just be careful. This isn't the best neighborhood to fall asleep in." "Thank you," Alejandro replied with a polite smile, though he still seemed a bit confused. Marcos returned the ID, and as the young man started the car and drove away, he stayed there, watching the red lights until they disappeared into the distance. A mix of disbelief and hope filled his chest. It was impossible, but his heart, after so long, seemed to have found a trail to follow, a spark that dragged him back to the past. Without thinking much, Marcos got into his patrol car and drove straight to the station's archive room. If this young man really was Samuel, if somehow his son was alive, he needed proof, he needed clarity. He couldn't hold on to mere assumptions or simple coincidence. The feeling of uncertainty filled him, reminding him of the helplessness he felt that first night of searching, years ago, when Samuel disappeared. With firm steps, he entered the archive room, almost deserted at that hour. The silence accompanied him, and the sound of papers and files reconnected him with memories of his darkest time. He searched through the files until he found the documents on Samuel's disappearance, his hands trembling as he pulled out the folder worn by time. As he went through the pages, a figure appeared behind him. It was his lifelong colleague and friend, Patricia, who watched his search with a worried expression. "What are you doing here at this hour, Marcos?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Don't tell me you're revisiting Samuel's case again." Marcos looked up, visibly shaken. "Patricia, I found someone tonight." "Someone who?" She looked at him skeptically. "The same thing again?" "I've told you, you need to let it go. Samuel is gone, and that." No, this time is different, he interrupted her. This young man was identical to him. Patricia, I looked into his eyes and I'm sure it was Samuel. Patricia sighed, but Marcos's tone made her pause any skeptical remarks. She knew him as a rational man, someone who didn't let himself be carried away by illusions, but she also knew that his loss had left deep scars. Are you sure? She finally asked, with a mix of doubt and curiosity. I can't explain it. I just need to know the truth. Something inside me says I'm close to discovering something important. Patricia hesitated, but eventually nodded. Then let me help you. If you're so sure, let's at least see if we can find anything else. For hours, they both reviewed documents, went over reports, and revisited the testimonies from that fateful night. They found details that had previously gone unnoticed, inconsistencies that had seemed trivial at the time but now took on new meaning. There were medical reports that contradicted each other, testimonies that seemed inaccurate. Everything pointed to something that had remained unresolved. Finally, with their minds exhausted and souls filled with doubts, Marcos and Patricia put the documents away. You're risking a lot, Marcos, Patricia said as she closed the last folder. If this is all a coincidence, I don't know if you can handle another disappointment. Marcos looked at her, and for the first time in years, his voice sounded firm, determined. If there's even a chance, I'm not going to let it slip away. I can't live with the idea that Samuel could be out there, waiting for me to find him. With that last phrase, the two said goodbye. Patricia patted him on the shoulder and left, leaving him alone in the dim archive room. Marcos looked once more at the folder, his fingers tracing the letters of that name he had learned to say with pain and nostalgia, Samuel. Not knowing what the future held, but feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen, Marcos turned off the light, determined to get to the bottom of that mystery, with the hope that, after so long, the answers he had longed for were within his reach. The next morning, Marcos went to the cemetery. The air was cold and dense, laden with the dampness of early morning dew. His footsteps echoed in the silence, and as he approached Samuel's grave, he felt a mix of nostalgia and anxiety he couldn't control. The image of the young man he had encountered the previous night wouldn't leave his mind. Alejandro Fuentes, the name, though unfamiliar, couldn't dispel the powerful sensation of being in his son's presence, an intuition he couldn't explain. Finally, he arrived at the spot where he had left flowers just a few days earlier. But something strange caught his attention. The earth around the headstone was disturbed, as if someone had been working on it. He crouched down and, upon touching the headstone, realized it was loose. With a mix of confusion and fear, he pushed slightly and discovered, with growing horror, that the grave was empty. He remained there, kneeling in silence, processing what he was seeing. A silent despair took hold of him, every fiber of his being feeling that his world, already fractured, was crumbling further. After what seemed like endless minutes, he took out his phone and called Patricia. She answered on the first ring. Patricia, you need to come to the cemetery. Something's happened with Samuel's grave. There was no question or hesitation in Patricia's voice, just a "I'm on my way" that brought him some comfort. A few minutes later, Patricia arrived at the cemetery, still in uniform, with the look of someone who expected no more surprises in life. But upon seeing the empty grave, her expression changed to one of disbelief and concern. Marcos, what does this mean? She asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, he replied, not taking his eyes off the empty grave. But I need to find out. I need to understand what happened. Patricia nodded, crouching beside him. This doesn't make sense, Marcos. Samuel's remains. You were there for the identification. We were all convinced that. Marcos shook his head. What if we were wrong? What if the remains we found weren't Samuel's? Patricia, last night I saw a young man who looked exactly like him. I can't shake the feeling that something's very wrong here. Patricia looked at him with a mix of compassion and doubt, but the conviction in Marcos's eyes was undeniable. Marcos, that sounds impossible. But if there's an explanation, we'll find it. I'll speak to the morgue and to those who were in charge of the DNA tests at the time. Maybe there's something we missed. With a nod, Marco stood up and took a few steps, trying to process the situation. His son, the one he thought he had lost 8 years ago, might be alive, but somewhere unknown and with no memory of his past. The thought was both terrifying and hopeful. "Let's go to the station," Patricia suggested after a few minutes. "Maybe we can go through the files and find something else." As they drove to the station, the silence between them was heavy, filled with a mix of pain and anticipation. Upon arrival, they headed to the archive, and Patricia began looking through the old records. Marcos, on the other hand, stared at the file of Samuel's disappearance, now with a new perspective. The possibility that his son was alive gave him a hope he hadn't felt in a long time, but also a deep worry. If Samuel had indeed survived, where had he been all these years? And why hadn't he returned? Patricia broke the silence. "Here's the original DNA report that confirmed the remains were Samuel's." She handed the folder to Marcos, who reviewed the documents carefully. However, one signature at the bottom of the report caught his attention, the name of the forensic scientist in charge of the test. "Do you remember this guy?" Marcos asked, pointing to the name. "He wasn't around the precinct for very long, if I recall correctly." Patricia nodded, frowning. "Yes, in fact, he was only here for a few months. After that, he moved to another city." Marcos pressed his lips together. "Maybe it's a coincidence, but I feel like we need to review this thoroughly. I want to make sure everything was done the right way." With renewed resolve, Marcos and Patricia embarked on a meticulous review of all the case details. Every page, every testimony, and every document was examined with a precision that only years of experience and determination could fuel. After several hours, Patricia sighed, closing a report. "Marcos, there's something about all of this that doesn't add up. It's not just the DNA report, it's the disappearance itself. Remember how the case seemed wrapped up in just a few days? It was unusually fast." Marcos nodded. "I remember. But at that time, I was so devastated that I just wanted answers, and I accepted whatever they offered. Maybe I was too quick to accept the official version." "And now?" Patricia asked, looking at him with concern. "Now I know something happened that night, something we didn't see at the time." Marcos carefully stored the documents, as if they were fragile pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to put together. "I'm going to find that young man, Patricia. I need to talk to him, see if I can uncover anything else." Patricia gave him a tired but understanding smile. "I know you'll do what you need to do, Marcos. And if you need help along the way, you know I'm here for you." Marcos gave her a grateful pat on the shoulder, and with renewed determination, he left the precinct. As he drove, he couldn't help but wonder who Alejandro Fuentes really was, and if his face was a sign of something much deeper and hidden. That same afternoon, Marcos looked up Alejandro's address and headed to his house. When he arrived, he found a large estate, a grand house surrounded by well-kept gardens, signs of a life of luxury. Marcos felt an odd emptiness as he took in the scene, the contrast between this life of privilege and the life he had imagined for Samuel tied his stomach in knots. After a few minutes, he approached the door and rang the bell. The door opened slowly and Alejandro appeared, looking at him in surprise. "Officer, Marcos, right?" Alejandro asked with a shy smile, recognizing him from the previous night. "Yes, Alejandro," Marcos replied, trying to keep his composure. "Do you have a moment to talk?" The young man nodded, slightly intrigued, and invited him to the garden. They sat at an outdoor table, surrounded by the scent of flowers and the sound of birds. For a few minutes, both remained silent until Marcos finally spoke. "Last night, when I saw you, I felt something very strange," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I can't explain it, but you bear a striking resemblance to someone who meant a lot to me." Alejandro looked at him, curious. "Who?" Marcos took a breath, feeling emotion making it hard to speak. "My son Samuel, who disappeared 8 years ago." Surprise was evident on Alejandro's face. I'm sorry. I didn't know you had lost someone." "I miss him," Marcos confessed, his voice breaking. "And for some reason, when I look at you, I feel as if he's here somehow." It's irrational, I know, but I've spent the whole night thinking about it. Alejandro stayed silent, processing his words. Finally, he looked Marcos in the eye. It's curious that you mentioned that. I've had dreams about a different life. Sometimes I think there's something I forgot, a part of me I can't remember. Marcos's heart skipped a beat upon hearing this. Alejandro, would you be willing to help me find out if there could be any connection between us? I know it sounds strange, but I feel it's important. Alejandro looked at him with a mixture of confusion and empathy. After a few seconds, he nodded slowly. I don't know what we'll find, but I'm willing to try. Marcos felt a spark of hope within him. That conversation was only the beginning of an uncertain path, but he was determined to follow it to the end, hoping that, at the end of this road, he would find the truth he had long sought. In the following days, Marcos and Alejandro continued meeting, exploring every corner of Alejandro's life in search of any connection that might reveal the truth. Alejandro, for his part, seemed increasingly intrigued and nervous, as if the conversations were awakening something deep within him, a part of his memory he was only beginning to glimpse. Marcos's questions about his childhood unsettled him, and although he couldn't clearly recall, he felt a mix of excitement and fear at the possibility of discovering who he really was. Marcos, on the other hand, was facing an internal struggle. Every day, he saw in Alejandro the gestures, the smile, and the gaze of Samuel, his lost son. This filled him with a painful hope, one he didn't dare share, fearing that in the end, there would be no connection. However, he couldn't stop. He needed answers, and Alejandro, in some way, seemed willing to provide them. One afternoon, while they were in the park, Marcos noticed how Alejandro watched a group of children playing near a fountain. The young man's gaze was deep and filled with melancholy, as if he was suddenly remembering something. Alejandro, Marcos asked, observing the expression on the young man's face. Alejandro blinked and turned his gaze toward him. Sometimes I feel like I remember this place. I don't know why, but I feel like I've been here before. It's as if something in my mind is trying to tell me something, but I can't understand it. Marcos nodded, trying not to project his own hopes onto Alejandro's words. Maybe those memories are there, buried in your mind, waiting for the right moment to surface. Alejandro sighed, and for a moment, the silence between them became heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. You know, Alejandro began, in a low voice, almost as if talking to himself. My adoptive parents never talked much about my past. I grew up in a wealthy family with private education and many comforts, but I always felt there was something that didn't add up, something they weren't telling me. Marcos looked at him with understanding, every word from the young man sparking curiosity in his mind. They never told you about your adoption? Alejandro slowly shook his head. They mentioned it in passing when I was little, but they never gave details. They just told me I was adopted and that it was enough. But I've had dreams I can't understand. What kind of dreams? Marcos asked, his voice full of anticipation. Alejandro looked at him intently, his dark eyes reflecting a mix of fear and hope. It's confusing. In my dreams, I see a man who holds my hand, who calls me Samuel. And I know it sounds crazy, but I always felt that name meant something. Marcos's heart skipped a beat when he heard that. Samuel? Does that name sound familiar to you? Alejandro nodded. Yes, though I don't know where it comes from. Every time I dream of him, I feel a deep connection, as if he's a part of me, but when I try to remember more, everything fades away. Marcos felt an overwhelming emotion, a mix of joy and sadness that made it hard to speak. Alejandro, I think that man in your dreams is me. The young man looked at him in surprise, trying to process what Marcos had just said. Are you saying that? Marcos nodded, trying to hold back his emotion. I'm saying I believe you are my son. My lost son. Silence overtook them, and for a few moments, only the sound of children playing in the distance and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees could be heard. Alejandro, visibly shaken, tried to absorb Marcos's words, not knowing if he should believe what he had just heard. I don't know what to say, he finally murmured, not taking his eyes off Marcos's face. "You don't have to say anything now," Marcos replied, trying to sound calm, though his heart was pounding. "I just want you to know I'm here for you, and that I'll do whatever it takes to discover the truth." The uncertainty in Alejandro's eyes softened a bit, and he slowly nodded. "If I really am Samuel, why don't I have any clear memory of all this? Why didn't my adoptive parents say anything?" "That's something I need to understand too," Marcos admitted, his voice heavy with sadness and determination. "Maybe there's something in your past they prefer to keep hidden. Something they might not want you to find out." That thought filled them both with intrigue and a sense of looming danger. They decided to investigate together, starting with searching for clues at Alejandro's house. Alejandro explained that his adoptive parents were extremely reserved and used to keep locked away any documents related to his adoption and any information about his past. But Alejandro remembered an old box he had seen hidden in his adoptive father's study, an ancient-looking chest that, until that moment, hadn't seemed relevant. That same night, Alejandro went home, determined to find that box and see if it held any clues. He waited until his adoptive parents were asleep and, silently, slipped into the study. Opening the door, his heart was pounding. He felt a mix of fear and excitement, aware that what he was about to discover could change his life forever. The study was dark, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the window. With trembling hands, Alejandro turned on a lamp and searched behind a bookshelf where he remembered seeing the chest. Carefully, he pulled it out and placed it on the desk. It was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. He took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside, he found old documents, yellowed papers, and a series of photos. At first, he didn't understand the significance of these images, but as he examined the first few, his heart stopped. There were photos of him as a child, but also photos of a family he didn't recognize. In one of them, a young man was holding a child in his arms, and although the child's face was blurred, Alejandro knew, deep in his soul, that this child was him. And that man was Marcos. With trembling hands, Alejandro took a letter from the bottom of the box, a letter written by someone who called himself the adoptive father. In it, there was talk of a deal, of a secret adoption, and how it was better to keep Alejandro in the dark to protect him. The words were cold and calculated, as if he was nothing more than a pawn in a chess game. At that moment, Alejandro heard a noise in the hallway. Quickly, he closed the box and turned off the light, hiding behind the desk. The study door opened, and he saw his adoptive father enter with a serious expression, as if he suspected something was out of place. "Who's there?" the man called out, his voice deep. Alejandro held his breath, feeling adrenaline flood his body. However, after a few seconds of silence, his adoptive father seemed convinced that no one was there and left the study, closing the door behind him. Alejandro stayed there, trembling, as he processed what he had just discovered. He knew he couldn't stay silent. He needed to confront Marcos with the information he had found. That night, he took the photos and the most revealing documents and left the house, determined to find answers. The next morning, he met with Marcos at a cafe on the other side of the city. Alejandro's face showed a mix of confusion and determination as he spread the photos across the table. "Marcos, I think you were right," Alejandro said, his voice breaking. "I found these photos and this letter. I think my life has been a lie." Marcos looked at the documents in silence, feeling the truth finally reveal itself to him. The letter, the photos, and the secret kept for so long confirmed that his son, whom he had believed lost forever, had been living a completely different life, unaware of who he truly was. "Samuel," Marcos said, calling him by his true name for the first time. "I know this is a lot, but I promise we'll uncover the truth together. I won't let you keep living in this lie." Alejandro nodded, feeling a sense of belonging for the first time. The truth was coming to light, and although the path was uncertain, he knew he was no longer alone. In the days following the discovery of the photos and letter, Alejandro could barely sleep. The image of his adoptive father entering the study that night kept haunting him, and the mixture of anger and betrayal dominated his thoughts. The revelation that his life had been manipulated and that his own adoptive parents had hidden his true identity filled him with confusion and resentment. However, above all those feelings, an overwhelming sadness consumed him. He had lost the first years of his life, and now his identity was like a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together. On the other hand, Marcos, with renewed patience, tried to be a pillar of support for Alejandro. Every meeting with him filled him with a mixture of joy and pain. Seeing his son grown into a young adult brought him unexpected peace, but at the same time, he felt the loss of the years they could never get back. He knew he had to be strong and stay calm because Alejandro was at an emotional crossroads, and the last thing he wanted was to scare him or push him too hard. One morning, while they were having coffee in the small bar where they usually met, Marcos broke the silence with a calm voice, though his words were loaded with emotion. "Samuel." "Alejandro," he corrected, noticing the slight flinch from Alejandro at hearing the name. "I know this is a lot to take in. I don't want you to feel like I'm forcing you into anything. If you need time, space, just say the word." Alejandro, who had been looking at his cup in silence, lifted his gaze and met Marcos's eyes. There was pain in his eyes, but also determination. "I don't know which name belongs to me now," he admitted, with a hint of bitterness. "Alejandro is the name I know, but Samuel. Samuel is the name of someone I was, or someone I should have been." He sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "This isn't easy, Marcos. I want to remember, but at the same time, I'm afraid of what I might find." Marcos nodded slowly, understanding the inner tension of his son. "I know, son. It's like opening a door without knowing what's on the other side. But I'm here with you, and we won't face it alone." At that moment, Alejandro raised his hand to pull out the letter and photos he had taken from his adoptive parents' house. He spread them out on the table and, with a trembling voice, said to Marcos, "Last night, when I got home, I confronted them. I asked them about this letter and everything I had found. I knew they were lying, but I wasn't ready to hear the truth." Marcos looked at him in silence, allowing him the space to continue. "My adoptive mother didn't want to talk," Alejandro continued, his eyes fixed on the letter. "But my father admitted that they adopted me under dubious circumstances. He told me a mutual friend contacted them, saying there was a child in need of a family and that the whole process was discreet." Marcos felt a wave of anger at those words. "Discreet? They call that discreet? They tore you away from your life, Samuel." Alejandro raised a hand, trying to calm him. "I know, Marcos, I know. But there's more. My adoptive father hinted that there was money involved. He said they did it because they wanted a child, and seeing my mother so devastated by the loss of her own son, they thought it was an opportunity, a way to heal." Marcos clenched his fists, his gaze dark and serious. "That doesn't justify anything. You were my son, and they had no right to tear you away from our family." "I know," Alejandro said, his voice filled with profound sadness. "And believe me, I feel an immense anger too. Everything I thought I knew about myself has fallen apart in a matter of days." Marcos took a deep breath, trying to soften his expression. "But now you know who you really are. You have the right to know your story and, if you decide, to leave behind those who deceived you." Alejandro looked at him with an expression of confusion and longing. "And if my life has always been a lie, how do I build something real from the ruins of what I knew?" Marcos took his hand with a gesture of tenderness. "Son, you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and everything you've been through, difficult as it is also a part of you. None of this is your fault. I have wished for this moment for years, but I can't imagine the weight you must feel now. I just want you to know that whatever happens, you have someone who loves you." Alejandro's expression softened, and his eyes filled with tears he quickly tried to hide. "Thank you, Marcos, Dad. This is new for me, but I need time to process it all." As they talked, Patricia entered the cafe with a frown on her face. Seeing the somber expressions on both of their faces, she approached and sat down at the table, laying out some documents she was holding. I have important information, she announced in a low voice, looking at both of them. After reviewing the adoption files and making some calls, I discovered that not only was your adoption irregular, Samuel, she said, referring to Alejandro by his birth name. There's a man, a lawyer who facilitated the process, and it seems he's still active, working on similar cases. Alejandro frowned. You mean there are other cases? Other children who? Exactly, Patricia confirmed, as she handed a report to Marcos. This lawyer has worked on illegal adoption cases for years, and so far, he's managed to avoid getting caught. But thanks to the information I found in the records, I think we have enough evidence to charge him and expose this network. Marcos and Alejandro exchanged looks with a mixture of determination and anger. This man had been a key player in the fate that separated them as father and son, and now, confronting him was the only way to close that wound. Alejandro pressed his lips together, a spark of resolve in his eyes. If this lawyer had something to do with my adoption, I want to confront him. I want to know why they decided to change my life and kept me in the dark for so many years. Marcos nodded. You have every right to demand answers, son. This isn't just about what they did to us, but about the lives of other children who may have also been taken from their families. Patricia explained that, while the process of charging the lawyer would be long and complex, their testimony and the documents Alejandro had found at his adoptive parents' house were valuable evidence. After coordinating a meeting with prosecutors, Patricia left, leaving them alone to continue processing the magnitude of what they were about to face. On the way home, Alejandro and Marcos remained silent. It was a dense silence, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions that weighed heavily in the air. As they reached the door of his house, Alejandro stopped and looked at Marcos. Marcos, Dad, he corrected, struggling to get used to the word. Thank you. I know this isn't easy for either of us, but I'm grateful you're here with me. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you. Marcos patted his shoulder with a warm smile that hid years of sadness finally released. I swear I won't leave you alone, Samuel. All that's left is for us to fight together and make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Alejandro nodded, with a slight smile that reflected a mix of relief and hope. As they entered together, each with a clear mission, they realized that, although the road ahead was long and difficult, at least they had a chance to find justice and build something real. They both knew that, from that moment on, their search was no longer just for answers, but for a redemption that would bind them forever. The weeks following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. Alejandro and Marcos, accompanied by Patricia, began to devise a plan to confront the lawyer and the network that protected him. They knew that facing this enemy would require not only evidence, but also a carefully thought-out strategy, as they were dealing with a powerful figure with connections and experience in evading the law. One afternoon, while Marcos and Alejandro reviewed the documents Patricia had obtained, Alejandro looked up, uneasy. Are you sure about this, Dad? He asked quietly. Although the word Dad still sounded strange on his lips, the closeness he had developed with Marcos made it feel more natural each time. Marcos nodded, his expression serious. Samuel, we're not only fighting for what they did to us. Think of how many more families have been destroyed by this network. These men have grown rich trafficking lives. There is no justification for what they have done. Alejandro took a deep breath, absorbing the weight of Marcos's words. He knew that his life had been manipulated and that the lost memories of his childhood had been the price of a corrupt network that sold children's futures for money. I want them to pay for what they did, he murmured, feeling a fierce determination settle within him. As they organized the documents and prepared testimonies, Patricia arrived with important news. Good news, she said, entering the room with a satisfied expression. I convinced the prosecutor to authorize a search warrant for the lawyer's office. He's on our side and will help us get to the bottom of this. Does that mean we'll have access to all his records? Marcos asked, surprised. Exactly, confirmed Patricia, smiling slightly. We know this lawyer is only a piece, but his office may have documents exposing others involved. This is our best chance to dismantle this network. Alejandro listened in silence, processing the magnitude of the situation. Do you think my adoptive parents knew about all this? He asked suddenly, his voice tinged with restrained sadness. Patricia and Marcos exchanged a look, and she responded. It's possible they knew more than they admitted. But it's also possible they were simply clients when the lawyer was looking for suitable families. Either way, it's a risk they'll need to face. Alejandro nodded, feeling a mix of resentment and distrust towards those who had been his adoptive parents. Knowing that his childhood years had been stolen by an unscrupulous transaction filled him with a pain he couldn't express. However, the thought that by confronting this network, he was bringing justice to his story gave him the strength to keep going. Days later, Patricia received a notification confirming the date the operation would take place. The plan was to raid the lawyer's office, seize files, and capture any evidence of the illegal adoptions he had arranged over the years. Alejandro and Marcos couldn't participate directly in the intervention, but they would stay in touch with Patricia, ready to help however they could. The night before the intervention, Marcos and Alejandro had a conversation in which, for the first time, they could talk about topics they had avoided for weeks. Do you think I'll ever recover those lost years? Alejandro asked, his voice barely audible, his eyes fixed on the wall. Marco sighed, moving closer and placing a hand on his shoulder. We can't get back the time, son. But we have something better, the chance to create memories together. It doesn't matter how long you've lived in darkness. Now you're here, and that's what matters most. Alejandro nodded, visibly moved. Sometimes I think about how different my life would have been if they had never separated me from you, but then I remember that I'm here, and I have the chance to know the person who should have been by my side from the beginning. And I thank you every day for giving me that chance, Samuel, Marcos replied, his voice filled with emotion. The next morning, Patricia and the police team headed to the lawyer's office. Alejandro and Marcos waited at the precinct, with anxiety coursing through their veins. Finally, after hours of waiting, Patricia called them. We got it, she announced with a tone of satisfaction. Documents, records, lists of adoptions, it's all here. And among the files, we found a list with the names of children who, like you, were given to adoptive families without legal authorization. Samuel, your name was there. Marcos and Alejandro looked at each other, both aware they had taken a crucial step towards understanding the scale of the case. The fact that Alejandro's name was on that list was the final confirmation that his life had been manipulated and his childhood stolen by that network. Days later, Patricia, Marcos, and Alejandro met with the prosecutor, who explained that, based on the evidence found, he had decided to take the case to trial. The hearing would be public, and all those involved, including the lawyer and his contacts within the system, would be called to answer for their crimes. Additionally, Alejandro would have the chance to testify and share his story with the court, a task that filled him with nerves, but that he knew he had to do. The night before the trial, Alejandro was alone in his room, rehearsing in his mind what he would say. His heart was pounding, and his thoughts were clouded by fragmented memories of his childhood, blurry images, and distant sounds that tried to take shape in his memory. He knew that this testimony would be his chance to close the cycle of pain and reveal the truth. The next morning, upon entering the courtroom, Alejandro felt a deep silence within himself, as if the weight of the years was slowly dissipating. Marcos was by his side, offering a comforting presence. When it was his turn to speak, Alejandro stood up and, with his gaze fixed on those present, began to tell his story. My name is Samuel, though I spent most of my life believing my name was Alejandro Fuentes, he began, his voice steady. I grew up thinking I was an adopted child, that I had been chosen by a family who loved me. But what I didn't know was that my story was built on a lie. I was separated from my real father, Marcos, without his knowledge, without his consent. As Alejandro spoke, the courtroom filled with a tense silence. The story he told echoed throughout, as he detailed how the network of illegal adoptions had stolen his identity, turning his life into a mask of what it could have been. The emotion in his words was palpable, and more than one face in the audience was wet with tears as they listened to the tale of his struggle and pain. Today, I'm here not only to seek justice for myself, but for all the children and families who have been victims of this network, Alejandro concluded, his voice breaking with emotion. No child should be treated as an object that can be bought and sold. I'm here to make sure that my story is the last one. As he finished, Alejandro felt a wave of relief that left him almost without strength. He had released a weight he had unknowingly carried for years, and now, in front of everyone, his truth had been heard. The trial continued, and in the end, the verdict was clear. The lawyer and all those involved in the illegal adoption network were found guilty and sentenced to long prison terms. Marcos and Alejandro, hearing the verdict, looked at each other in silence, a deep peace settling in their hearts. Outside, as they walked together to the car, Alejandro stopped and looked at Marcos. "Thank you, Dad, for not giving up, for being here." Marcos smiled at him, feeling that they were finally on the path to a life free of shadows. "Thank you, Samuel, for being so brave. Now we can start over, with the certainty that our story is true." They hugged, knowing that, although the journey had not been easy, they had faced it together. And in that embrace, they sealed a new beginning, a promise to build a life together filled with truth and hope. Alejandro and Marcos tried to resume a normal life after the trial. The case had drawn media attention, and their story became public, exposing the illegal adoption network and the pain of many families. Alejandro knew this was the closure he needed, but as the days passed and the media noise faded, a feeling of emptiness began to settle in him. He had freed himself from the weight of his story, but now he had to build his own identity, to know who he was beyond the tragedies that had shaped him. Marcos noticed this, but respected Alejandro's space, knowing that, after pain and struggle, finding peace was sometimes the greatest challenge. One evening, while they were having dinner in Marcos's small apartment, Alejandro finally broke the silence. "Dad," he began, with a mixture of doubt and sincerity, "did you ever feel like you'd forgotten how to live after losing me? Because, now that it's all over, I feel like I don't know how to begin." Marcos set his fork down and looked at him with the serene, understanding gaze of someone who had learned to accept pain as part of his story. "Of course I felt that way, Samuel. It took me years to figure out how to move on without you. There were days when everything felt empty, without purpose. But I learned that, though the pain stays, it also leaves room for life, for love. You now have that opportunity, and I want you to take the time to figure out what you want, without rushing." Alejandro nodded, his eyes filled with the sadness he was still struggling to understand. "What's hardest for me is knowing who I really am. I spent so much time being Alejandro, growing up with an identity that now feels foreign. And Samuel? Samuel is someone I don't remember, someone who belongs to a past that was taken from me. I don't know where I fit." Marcos placed his hand over Alejandro's, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to fit into any mold. Samuel and Alejandro are both part of you, and you don't have to choose between them. You can be both or neither, whatever you choose to be. What matters is what you want to build now." Alejandro reflected silently on Marcos's words, and that night he fell asleep on the apartment couch, feeling, for the first time, an unexpected peace. Maybe he didn't need to cling to a name, but instead, create his own identity. The next day, he decided to talk to Patricia. He felt he needed to understand more about the investigation, about how they had finally managed to capture everyone involved. He found her at the station, and upon seeing him, Patricia greeted him with a knowing smile. "How are you, Alejandro?" she asked, although the familiarity of recent times made her correct herself with a smile. "Samuel." Alejandro smiled, but his expression quickly changed to a mix of curiosity and anxiety. "I've been fine, but I wanted to talk to you. I feel like there's something I don't completely understand about all of this. I know they caught the lawyer and his contacts, but what about the families who took those children? Will anything be done in those cases?" Patricia sighed, thinking carefully about her response. "It's complicated, Samuel. Some of those families adopted those children without really knowing what was happening behind the scenes, believing everything was legitimate. The children deserve to know the truth, but it's also hard to separate those who acted in good faith from those who knew something was wrong and chose to ignore it." Alejandro looked at her in silence, understanding the complexity of the situation. He himself had grown up believing his life was completely normal, but over time, he began to notice inconsistencies, to question the stories he had been told. So, some of those families won't be investigated? Patricia nodded. Some will be investigated more thoroughly, but others, it's likely they'll never face justice. But sometimes the truth, even if late, eventually comes to light. Alejandro couldn't help but feel a pang of pain, thinking of the families who might never have the chance to know what really happened. I just hope that, at least, those children grow up with the love and truth they deserve. Patricia patted him on the shoulder, smiling tenderly. You've become stronger than you think, Samuel. And that strength is going to help you face whatever comes. In the days that followed, Alejandro decided to take one more step in his healing process. He visited the old neighborhood where he lived before the accident, when he was still Samuel. He walked through the park where he used to play as a child, vaguely remembering moments that came back to him in flashes, small fragments reconnecting him with a life that had been forgotten. He recognized an ice cream shop where he remembered going with his mother, a swing where his father used to push him. He felt those lost images coming to life, and as he walked, the place felt more like his, more part of who he was now. Returning home, he found Marcos waiting at the doorstep with a nostalgic smile. How was it, going back to your old home? Alejandro sighed, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and peace. It was strange, but also necessary. I feel like now I'm starting to connect the pieces of my life. Marcos hugged him, moved to see his son take control of his own identity, building his story with every step he took. Samuel, or Alejandro, or however you wish to call yourself, you're my son. I'm proud of who you have become. That night, as they talked on the balcony, Alejandro looked at the stars and, with a smile, said quietly, as if speaking only to himself, I think I'm ready to start writing my own story. Marcos looked at him, smiling warmly. Then do it, son. Make that story so much yours that no one can ever take it away from you. The two of them stayed there, under the starlit sky, aware that while the past had marked their lives, it had also given them the drive to build a future together. A year after the trial, Alejandro and Marcos found themselves in a very different place. They had traveled a difficult path, overcoming pain and confusion, confronting the truth of a fragmented story and the uncertainty of how to start over. Now, on a warm spring day, the two of them stood on top of a hill, from which they could see the city spread out under a clear sky. Marcos held a small wooden box in his hands, and they both looked at the horizon in silence. Alejandro took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air on his face. You know, for so long, I thought I'd never understand who I was. Everything felt like a shadow, a mix of memories I couldn't define. Marcos nodded, listening to each word with full attention. And now, how do you feel? Alejandro smiled, a sincere and calm smile that no longer had traces of the doubts that once accompanied him. I feel at peace. I've realized I don't need to cling to just one name or just one past. Samuel and Alejandro are both part of me, and instead of trying to choose between them, I've decided to embrace them both. Marcos looked at him with bright eyes, proud of the strength he had seen grow in his son. That means you now have the power to decide your own path. You know where you come from, and you know where you want to go. Yes, Alejandro replied, looking at the box Marcos held. Inside, they kept some memories, the photo of him as a child in his biological mother's arms, the document that had revealed the truth of his identity, and a letter he had written to himself, promising to honor his life and his story. Those memories belong to me, but they've also taught me that I'm more than what happened to me. You always were, said Marcos, his voice full of emotion. Memories aren't chains, they're doors. And you, Samuel Alejandro, you've found a way to open them and make them yours. Alejandro looked at him with gratitude. This man, his father, had waited for 8 long years, had suffered and fought alone, but never gave up. It was that perseverance that had brought them both to this moment, and Alejandro knew that now, more than ever, he was where he was meant to be. In silence, they both sat on the grass, leaving the box between them. Marcos looked up at the sky and, after a moment of silence, spoke softly, as if sharing a secret with the wind. You know, for a long time, I wondered if I would ever feel peace. All I did was search for you, living with the pain of not having answers. I was consumed by the fear of losing you, and I thought I'd never be able to let go of that fear. Alejandro listened, moved by the depth of his father's words. But you did it, he said softly. You never stopped fighting, you never gave up. And thanks to that, we're here now. Marcos nodded, his eyes bright with tears. Yes, we made it. But the most important thing is that I discovered that while the pain will always be there, it doesn't have to be an obstacle. You taught me that it's possible to live with it and still be happy. Alejandro looked at him, a deep understanding lighting up his face. That's true. I think we all have parts of ourselves that hurt, parts that will never fully heal. But that doesn't mean we can't move forward. They both fell silent, enjoying the moment, understanding that they had arrived at a place of peace. Everything they had gone through had transformed them, made them stronger, and given them a perspective on life that few achieve. There was no need for more words. The shared silence was enough to express all they felt. Finally, Alejandro took the box and, with a smile, looked at Marcos. Let's bury this here, he said. Those memories and those moments are part of me, but now I'm free to move on. I want this place to be a symbol of what we've overcome, a reminder that there's always hope. Marcos nodded, moved, and together they dug a small hole in the ground. They placed the box inside, and they both covered it with soil and flowers they found nearby, leaving there not only their memories, but also the promise of a new beginning. When they were done, Alejandro reached out and gave Marcos a warm hug, full of love and gratitude. In that hug, they sealed the promise of a shared future, one where the ghosts of the past would no longer dictate their lives. As they walked down the hill, Alejandro felt a deep serenity, as if all the pieces had finally come together. He looked at Marcos and, with a smile, said, "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for helping me find myself." Marcos returned the smile, his heart full of pride. "You don't need to thank me, son. I'll always be by your side, and no matter which path you choose, you'll always have my support." They continued walking, leaving the hill behind, with light hearts and the certainty that together they could face anything life might bring. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments what you would do in a similar situation. We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a way of showing support. This motivates us to keep bringing exciting stories practically every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you here with us. You can click on the links appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. A warm hug.